December 7, 1941. Oahu, Hawaii. The morning air at Pearl Harbor usually carries the scent of salt spray and tropical hibiscus, but today, it is choked with the thick, oily stench of burning bunker sea fuel. Below the surface of the emerald waters, the silence of the deep is shattered by the rhythmic, metallic trum-trum-trum of Japanese propellers overhead. The water vibrates against the hulls of the Pacific Fleet, a low-frequency hum that precedes the scream of the Vels and Kates diving from the clouds. In the mud of the harbor floor, the USS West Virginia groans, her steel spine twisting under the impact of 7 Type 91 aerial torpedoes. She is a behemoth of the Colorado class, a floating fortress of 32,000 tons, yet in this moment, she is being gutted. As she settles into the silt, the water rushing into her gashed side sounds like a long, rattling intake of breath, a dying gasp. The Japanese planners in the Kure Naval District had spent years calculating this moment. To the Imperial Japanese Navy, the battleship was a symbol of the old world, a lumbering titan that they had just proven was obsolete. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto's strike force had come not just to damage a fleet, but to conduct an execution. As the West Virginia settled into the oily muck of the harbor floor, her decks awash and her superstructure a twisted cage of blackened steel, the Japanese aviators looking down from their cockpits saw a corpse. In the rigid, mathematical philosophy of the Japanese High Command, a ship on the bottom of the ocean was a shade removed from the board of history. They believed in the decisive battle, a singular stroke of violence that would shatter the American will. They looked at the charred mass of the VV and saw the tombstone of Western influence in the Pacific. To them, the battleship was dead, and with it, the American era. However, the Japanese failed to understand the nature of the adversary they had awakened. They saw the United States as a soft, consumerist society, a nation of shopkeepers and jazz listeners who lacked the spiritual discipline of Bushido. They expected that the sight of their indestructible giants lying in the mud would lead to a psychological collapse. But for the American sailors and the civilian divers who flocked to the docks of Pearl Harbor in the weeks following the attack, the West Virginia was not a funeral pyre. She was a machine. And in the American mind, any machine can be fixed if you have enough tools, enough time, and enough air. The background of this defiance lies in the industrial soul of the United States. While Japan operated on a philosophy of scarcity and spiritual purity, the Americans operated on a philosophy of mechanical abundance. This would be represented by one constant, recurring sound throughout the long years of the Salvage, the steady, rhythmic hiss of the air compressor. This sound, the sound of compressed air being forced down into the lungs of men working in the dark, became the heartbeat of the American recovery. It was a sound that Japan could not replicate, for it required a logistical chain and a technical infrastructure that saw the ocean not as a graveyard, but as a temporary obstacle. By January 1942, the salvage operation began in earnest. The conditions inside the sunken West Virginia were a descent into a literal hell. The ship had been torn open by torpedoes that left holes large enough to drive a truck through. The interior was a labyrinth of pitch-black corridors, filled with a toxic, gelatinous slurry of seawater, decomposed rations, medical supplies, and thousands of gallons of thick, black fuel oil. The divers who descended into this abyss were encased in the Mark V deep-sea diving dress, a 200-pound suit of copper and canvas. As they disappeared beneath the surface of the harbor, they left behind a world of sunlight and entered a world of touch. The historical records of the Pearl Harbor Navy Yard salvage cruise describe a feat of endurance that defies modern engineering standards. Divers spent over 20,000 hours underwater, often working by feel alone because the oil was so thick that even the most powerful underwater lamps could not penetrate more than an inch. They had to navigate the jagged, razor-sharp edges of torpedo-torn steel in total darkness. The emotional contrast was stark. The Japanese believed these men would be broken by the scale of the disaster, but instead, the divers found a grim, mechanical purpose. They were not just salvaging steel, they were reclaiming their pride. The transformation of the West Virginia began with the patching. The American engineers decided on a plan so audacious it seemed impossible. They would build a massive timber and concrete coffer patch underwater to seal the torpedo wounds. While the Axis powers were already beginning to feel the pinch of resource rationing, the Americans arrived with trainloads of Douglas fir, tons of cement, and an endless supply of rubber hoses. The hiss of the airlines never stopped. It was the sound of a nation that possessed the luxury of oxygen. Within the wreckage, the divers made discoveries that changed their perception of the mission. In one compartment, after months of pumping, they found the remains of 3 sailors in a storeroom. They found a calendar where these men had marked off 16 days of surviving in the dark, breathing the air trapped in the overheads, waiting for a rescue that couldn't hear their frantic tapping. When the salvage crews saw those 16 marks, the work stopped being a job and became a holy war. They realized that the ship had fought to stay alive even as she sat on the bottom. The ideology of the beautiful death held no sway here. There was only the American obsession with survival and the refusal to stay down. The Japanese intelligence services, hearing reports of the salvage, dismissed them as propaganda. To their naval architects, the West Virginia was a total loss. They calculated the displacement, the center of gravity, and the structural integrity of a torpedoed hull, and their slide rules told them the ship was a permanent part of the Hawaiian Reef. But the Americans weren't using slide rules, they were using the sheer, brute force of industrial capacity. They pumped 600,000 tons of water out of the hull. They used massive submersible pumps that groaned under the weight of the sea, all fueled by that same steady hiss of power. The technical brilliance of the salvage was not merely in the lifting, but in the preservation. Every piece of machinery, every electrical motor, and every turbine had to be painstakingly cleaned of the salt and oil that threatened to corrode the ship's heart. This was where the American gift for improvisation shone brightest. While Japanese doctrine relied on the replacement of entire units, American sailors spent weeks with toothbrushes and solvent, reviving motors that had been submerged for months. They treated the ship as a living organism that had suffered a trauma, but whose spirit remained intact within its iron bones. As the months bled into 1943, the perception of the war began to shift within the ranks of the salvage crews. They were no longer just laborers, they were alchemists turning leaden defeat into golden defiance. The Japanese ideology of Bushido emphasized the honorable death, the beautiful end. The Americans countered with the ideology of the second chance. To the US Navy, nothing was truly gone as long as it could be reached. This was the industrial might of democracy expressed through a diving wrench. The symbolic hiss of the air hose represented a nation that could provide its sons with the tools to breathe underwater, to work in the dark, and to defy the gravity of a military disaster. By May 1942, the WV did the impossible. She rose. As the water was sucked from her bowels, the buoyancy returned to her battered frame. She groaned as the mud off Pearl Harbor let go of her keel, a sound like a giant waking from a coma. When she finally floated, she was a ghastly sight, covered in barnacles, dripping with oil, and smelling of the grave. But she was afloat. The Japanese believed the battleship was dead. The American divers proved that in a democracy, even the dead can be drafted back into service. The ship was sent to the West Coast, where she underwent a transformation that mirrored the awakening of the American war machine. She wasn't just repaired, she was reborn. Her old cage masts were lopped off and replaced with modern bridges. She was bristling with new 5-inch guns, Bofors, and Oerlikons. Most importantly, she was given ICE, the latest Mark 8 fire control radar. While the Japanese still relied on the superb eyesight of their lookouts and the traditional methods of naval warfare, the West Virginia was now a cyborg of steel and electronics. The ship's return to the Pacific was a psychological hammer blow to the Japanese command. Reports began to filter back to Tokyo of a battleship that looked like the West Virginia, sounded like the West Virginia, but was supposed to be at the bottom of the Hawaiian mud. The Japanese sailors, who had been told they had destroyed the backbone of the American fleet, now faced a haunting reality. Their maps and their memories said the West Virginia was dead. Their radar and their lookouts said she was coming for them. The culmination of this defiance occurred on October 25, 1944, at the Battle of Surigao Strait. In the pitch blackness of the Philippine night, a Japanese task force led by the battleship Yumashiro steamed into a trap. Admiral Shoji Nishimura, a man steeped in the traditions of the Imperial Navy, believed he was sailing toward a glorious engagement. He did not know that waiting for him in the darkness was a ghost. The West Virginia, resurrected from the mud of Oahu, was the first to see the enemy on her radar screens. The hiss of the airlines from the salvage docks had been replaced by the electronic hum of the radar room. At a range of 22,400 yards, the West Virginia opened fire. Her 16-inch guns, the very ones that had been submerged in the oil and filth of Pearl Harbor, unleashed a thunderous volley. The shells, each weighing as much as a small car, screamed through the night air. The Japanese were horrified. They were being hit by accurate, heavy fire from an enemy they couldn't see. The Yumashiro, a sister ship in concept to the West Virginia, was torn apart by the ghost of Battleship Row. The ship the Japanese had killed 3 years prior was now the one delivering the final blow to the Imperial Japanese Navy's traditional surface fleet. It was the last time battleships would ever do in the history of the world, and it was won by the ship that refused to sink. This battle was the ultimate vindication of the divers' labor. Every hour spent in the toxic darkness of the harbor floor, every breath drawn through a rubber hose, and every pound of concrete poured into the hull had led to this moment. The Yumashiro sank into the depths of the Surigao Strait, joining the list of ships that the Japanese had thought were the victors. The irony was absolute: the victim had become the executioner. The symbolism of the air hose, the umbilical cord of the divers, reflects a larger truth about the American experience in World War II. It was a war of logistics, of breathing when the world tried to drown you. The Japanese fought for an empire and a god emperor, seeking a poetic and final end. The Americans fought for the right to fix what was broken, to outbuild, outpump, and outlive the catastrophe. Even after the victory at Surigao Strait, the West Virginia did not rest. She moved on to Iwo Jima and Okinawa, providing the heavy fire support that shielded American Marines from the suicidal fury of the Japanese defenders. In these final months of the war, she was no longer a ghost, she was a legend. The Japanese defenders in the caves of Iwo Jima felt the ground shake under her 16-inch shells and knew that the power they had tried to bury at Pearl Harbor had returned with a vengeance. As the West Virginia stood in Tokyo Bay during the surrender ceremonies in 1945, her guns silent but her presence towering, the reflection of her hull in the water was a message to the world. A battleship is just steel, and steel can be melted. But the spirit of a crew, and the technical audacity of a nation that refuses to accept the finality of a sinking, is something that cannot be measured on a ledger. The Japanese dignitaries on the deck of the USS Missouri could look across the water and see the West Virginia, a ship they had claimed to sink years ago, standing as a silent witness to their defeat. The story of the West Virginia is the story of the second chance. It tells us that freedom is not found in the perfection of a single strike, but in the gritty, oily, dark work of recovery. It is found in the hiss of the oxygen line that allows a man to work at the bottom of the sea. It is the realization that abundance is not just about wealth, but about the abundance of will, the refusal to let the ocean, or an enemy, have the final word. Consider the divers one last time. They worked in a world where time was measured by the air in their tanks and the strength of their tethers. They faced the most terrifying environment on Earth, the inside of a drowned tomb, and they did not flinch. They saw the dead battleship and saw only a project that required more air. This is the essence of the American spirit, the belief that the depth of the fall does not determine the end of the journey. Acts of refusal, the refusal to sink, the refusal to stay down, and the refusal to let the darkness win. The battleship wasn't dead because the men in the copper helmets refused to stop pumping air. They believed in a future where the ship would sail again, and because they believed it, they made it so. This technical and emotional stubbornness is what won the war. It wasn't just the atomic bomb or the massive carrier fleets, it was the thousands of small. As the sun sets over the Pacific today, the waters of Pearl Harbor are calm. The oil still occasionally bubbles up from the remains of the USS Arizona, a reminder of the cost of that December morning. But the West Virginia is gone, long ago sold for scrap after her duty was done. Yet, her legacy remains in every vessel that defies the odds and every person who refuses to accept a defeat as final. The recurring hiss of the diver's airline reminds us that abundance is not just about having more steel or more oil, it is about the abundance of hope. It is the belief that no matter how deep the darkness or how heavy the water, the light of the surface is always reachable for those who refuse to stop breathing. In the end, the Pacific did not swallow the American fleet, it merely held it in trust until the divers came to take it back. The truth of freedom is that it is resilient. Like the West Virginia, it can be battered, it can be submerged, and it can be left for dead. But as long as there are those who are willing to descend into the mud, to breathe through the hose of democracy, and to work in the dark, it will always rise. The battleship was never dead, it was just waiting for the men who refused to let it sink. And in that refusal, the course of history was changed forever.